Now in this video I want to show you something really interesting you can do with blur. Now there's a new blur feature in Photoshop. There's actually a few new blur features as part of the blur gallery, but this particular one allows you to do some blurring that you never could do before in Photoshop, and it's called the path blur. Now what I'm going to show you here is something pretty cool, and that's to be able to create a spiral blur. But beyond what you see here, I encourage you to really experiment with this tool and play around with the various ways you can apply blurs in so many different directions within the same image using one filter. It's got some really interesting effects. I'm going to show you a couple of examples here of how I used the spiral blur, but again, I encourage you to go in there and play around with this feature among the other blur gallery effects. You'll get some really interesting results. Now, here I have a photo of this wedding photo. We all have our wedding shots. We've all shot a wedding or something like that. And I really want to add something to this, but not too much. I don't want to get too crazy with it. And a blur effect would really be fun. Now, in the past, I probably would have thought maybe, trying some depth of field with a little bit of foreground blurring, or even doing like a radial blur and then showing other effects like that. But I really want to take it, really kind of have the blur kind of have a depth to it. And that's what the spiral blur is going to do for me. So with the image selected, or in the layer itself selected, I'm going to go to the filter menu and go down here to blur gallery and choose path blur. Now, you'll notice that a path shows up right away inside of your image. Now, I'm going to go ahead and grab the end of this path and just move it around, and you'll see that the blur goes in the direction of the path itself. Now, what I'm going to do is position this path. I'll start right down here in the bottom right corner there. I'm just going to position the end path. Now notice the arrow. Now the arrow is important. It tells you what direction the blur is going to go when you set the speed here a little bit. So I'm going to set this here, and I'm going to give this path a curve by grabbing the center control handle and just bending the path here. Now, like other paths in Photoshop, you can go over here and just click on the path itself and add another control point, and then move this path along. And I'm just going to add more control points as I go around, eventually resulting in this kind of spiral effect that we got here. So I'm going to add another control point there. Let's go here. And again, you just couldn't do this in an earlier version of Photoshop. This is really taking blur effects to a new level by having a greater degree of control over where the blur itself is applied. So I think that looks pretty good. Obviously I can edit it. As you can see, I can go in here and fine tune where I put the control points. But what I want to do now is go over here to the Blur Tools panel, and I'm going to increase the amount of speed on this, and you'll notice the effect I get right away as it kind of twirls around there. Unlike the radial blur, where it's, would be a uniform radial blur, we're getting various degrees of blurring because it's a little less on the outside and gets a little bit tighter on the inside as the spiral gets closer and closer. And you can go in here and adjust other features as well. You can set the tapering, so you can actually have the blur kind of taper off as it goes along the path. Centered blur actually applies the blur centered to the path and just kind of goes outward. But you can turn it off and it will actually adjust the blur and then kind of have it go forward. So instead of a blur, like if you've got a static object and you blur it, you get the blur going on both sides of it. But when you turn off centered, it actually puts it to one either side there. So I can still move this around, and you'll see that the blur effect is live as I move the spiral path around here, and I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it like that. And then just go ahead and click OK. Now, one thing I forgot to do before I went into my blur feature is duplicate the layer, because I want to be able to blend this with the original. Now, this is a mistake I make often, and I'm kind of glad this happened because I want to show you an interesting little trick. Instead of undoing what I just did and going back and redoing it, now in this case it wouldn't be a big deal because you just hit Command F and reapply the filter. But if you've gone and done some painted effects or anything like that, and you want to go and get the original background layer, here's what you need to do. Go to the image menu, go to duplicate, and it will create a duplicate file. Go back to the original and just simply undo what you just did. Goes back to the original. Now I'm going to go to that duplicate file and then hold the Shift key down and just drag and drop it over, and now it's the effect on its own layer. So just a quick little trick there. Now I want to blend this image with that background. So I'm going to go ahead and apply a layer mask here and just go ahead and get a gradient tool. And I always use the foreground to transparent gradients when I'm blending images like this. So if you go into that gradient menu, it's the second one right here. And just make sure the foreground color is black by pressing D, then X. And then I'm just going to go into that layer mask and apply the gradient in the middle where the subjects are and just reveal that element there. Now look at that really cool effect I'm getting as a result. It's taken that image, simply applied a spiral blur on it, and I'm getting this interesting result. Now, I can go in here and perhaps darken this layer up so it creates more of a vignette effect. And let's make sure we're on the image and not the layer mask. We want to do that. So I can just increase my layers there to darken that and give this kind of cool vignette effect, but it's taking it to another level because of the ability to do that spiral blur on there. And that's it. That's all I've done, is just made that effect on its own layer, given it a blur, and it's really made the image something else. Something really cool and different entirely from the original. And the elements, I won't lie, the elements in this shot really lended themselves to it. The trees, the way they're bending and kind of going around the subject, the leaves and everything like that, it really kind of helps, sell that effect there by blending that in there. Now, what if it's just an image perhaps for a commercial use, or you just want to do it for a website or something like that? Well, again, same thing here. I'm going to go ahead and this time I'm going to go ahead and make the duplicate beforehand. So I'm just going to press Command J. And let's go back in there and apply our path blur once again. So in this time I'm going to position it right by the microphone here. Let's go ahead and curve the path here. And once you get in here, like I said, once you get in here and start playing with this and realize what it can do, that's when you'll open up, practically every image you have and try it, and you'll be really impressed with how interesting a result you can get in no time at all. And let's just kind of have this spiral going around here. We'll just have one more little whip of that right there, and that looks pretty good. Now, I'm going to go over and increase the speed, and you'll notice it really kind of gives you a freaky a result on the subject right there, right on his face especially, but that's okay. We're going to be masking that area out shortly anyway. But, and again, you can turn on or off centered blur, and you'll see that it changes the overall look of it. And this tends to get a little bit more motion to it. Notice how, and this really kind of illustrates this good, if I turn back on centered blur, look at the microphone. So the blur is kind of going in both directions on that, but when I uncheck centered, it really stays with the direction of the blur where the mic starts and then carries the blur on around there that way. So that's really just two ways of going about it, but you turn that feature on or off and see what results you get and see what you like. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. There we have that. Now, just like before, I'm going to add my layer mask, and let's go ahead and fade out the area of the subject here. And as I do that, you get this kind of cool, motion. And it's not just a motion blur, like I said, a uniform radial blur where it looks like it's a blur on top of the subject. It really kind of has a feeling of going around and, around the subject in space and everything like that. And I think that's pretty cool. Really pretty cool. I said pretty cool. But unlike I did last time, I'm actually going to apply a color cast to this layer this time. Let's kind of give it a blue cast there, not quite that kind of saturation. And then again, maybe make it a little bit darker to create that kind of vignette look about it. But just another way of looking at these blur features and the ability to go in there and apply them up to a path. Now another aspect of that path blur is you can create multiple paths. Notice I was just creating one spiral blur, but if you click away from your path and click again, you can actually establish a new path and actually have paths kind of crossing paths, if you will. And the blurs will actually give you a really interesting result there. So a lot of really interesting things you can do with that one blur feature. But again, go in there and play with those other blur gallery effects, and you'll get some interesting results with those as well.